Well, Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I have to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and for the next hour, hopefully, they're going to be views of Joel Skousen. Joel, are you there?
And Dr. Stan, good to be with you.
Oh, good to have you back. Well, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we're going to start talking off about the Bilderberg meeting. Although little insider information was extracted by Bilderberg watchers from this week's annual meeting of globalist leaders. One leak says that they are talking about pushing ahead with getting Assad out of Syria, and that's something I've been predicting. It's been very obvious that they want to get Syria into the hands of the globalists before Israel strikes Iran, so as to lessen the ability of Syria or stop it altogether from retaliating with its very large quantity of missiles that is a major threat to Israel. But one of the most prominent constitutional leaders protesting the secret Bilderberg leadership at the meeting was Alex Jones. Lyndon LaRouche disciple Webster Tarpley was also on hand. He's an anti-establishment historian often interviewed by Alex Jones and Jeff Renz. I've always been opposed to Tarpley's appearance on pro-liberty sites because he's never been on the side of liberty. His most virulent attacks recently on Ron Paul and Austrian economics during these recent interviews surrounding Bilderberg have quite frankly openly revealed the socialist FDR-type person that Tarpley really is. In any case, there was considerable controversy generated by a Guardian article that claims that 4 eyewitnesses in the hotel staff at Bilderberg in the Westfield Marriott there near Washington, D.C. have confirmed to the Guardian that Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney was on hand in the 2012 Bilderberg conference. However, Romney's staff disputes this, says that he was not at the meeting. Infowars.com claims that in his schedule there's a small gap that could explain his attendance at the Marriott meeting of the Bilderberg. I've looked into it myself, and I frankly very much doubt that the report is accurate. In fact, it's very unlikely, since Romney on Thursday, the day that they claim he was at Bilderberger, was all day in California and has a televised speech at the defunct solar company Solantrum that took into the early afternoon and had other engagements thereafter. So I think we have to, this source, by the way, was quoted by RT, Russia Today television, which is a KGB operation. So we have to be very skeptical of some of these reports that come out. But there was a lot of other fodder that came from this, especially spawned by Webster Tarpley, who had 2 major interviews posted on the Internet and YouTube while he was there. Both Alex Jones and Tarpley seem to think that Romney is an establishment Bilderberg-type person, though I have said from the beginning that the reason they tried to stop Romney from getting a nomination is that he is not. And in saying that, I'm not saying that Romney is a friend to the liberty movement. I don't believe he is, because I think he's bending more backwards trying to please the establishment. But I think we have to be very, very careful to draw conclusions about establishment support for Romney after they have attempted to block the nomination and now are getting behind him. It's not because a deal has been struck, but I think that they have to give the appearance that they are, in fact, supporting the person that they could not stop so that they could control him if he should chance to win the election. Well, Tarpley Tarpley added to Skelton's Guardian report that the elite politicians and bankers that make up a good chunk of the Bilderberg roster want a Romney administration to take Washington by storm. I disagree with that, of course. And he suspects that the recent meeting might have something to do with the secrecy of these groups' plans for the coming election. A lot of information has come out about past Bilderberg influence, or at least people who have attended Bilderberg before they ascend to political office in the U.S. John Kerry, of course, was a Bilderberger before he became a presidential candidate. So was John Edwards. Mitch Daniels, the current Indiana governor, was a Bilderberg this time and is talked about as a VP candidate. We know that Mark Rubio, for example, has turned into a flaming neocon in two speeches, one at Brookings Institution, which had a very decided globalist tone to it, and then another at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he's just sounding very much like Richard Pearl or any of the other neocons. Tarpley says that they want Romney and Mitch Daniels, who will run together as moderate rightists. Tarpley tells The Guardian. Daniels, Republican governor, is often mentioned. Well, let me talk about my opinion on Webster Tarpley. He's not on the side of liberty. He is a socialist and a former follower of Lyndon LaRouche, who in turn has many links with the Socialist International, a communist front, along with his European communist wife. LaRouche wormed his way into the conservative movement by putting out a lot of anti-Jane Fonda material and bashing the extreme environmental movement. But his agenda was not liberty, it was anti-capitalism. And so both of these people, Tarpley and LaRouche, are jumping on the conspiracy background against globalism because they view that as a pure capitalist phenomena rather than us, who view it as a crony capitalism, a minority of capitalists who jump into bed with government and use government to control it in their behalf, which is not the free market. Tarpley fits into this mold very well. He's a rabid anti-capitalist, and his acknowledged hero is Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the New Deal. All his solutions are socialist. He's been a regular contributor to the Alex Jones show because he's rather effective at slamming the New World Order and its globalist promoters, but not because he's against globalism or that he is for our restrictive interpretation of the Constitution. In fact, he hates the free market. He views rich capitalists as the real enemy, not government. Professor Kevin Barrett was shocked to hear these views as he interviewed Tarpley about the Bilderberg conference this week, and link in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief where to see that video. Tarpley makes all kinds of mistakes in judgment in this interview. He starts out by saying that the Bilderberg leadership is getting old, at least the most visible ones, and that they are preparing up-and-coming young Turks like Peter Thiel to take over. And he mentions Peter Thiel because he wants to attack Ron Paul constantly and says, well, if Peter Thiel, a Bilderberg attendee, has given money to Ron Paul, then Ron Paul and the Austrian economist must be part of this globalist conspiracy of capitalism to take over the good government programs like welfare, food stamps, and Head Start that we should all be in favor. Of course, you have to wonder what a person like Tarpley, spouting out all these government programs, is doing on conservative talk radio. Tarpley, of course, makes the erroneous link that because Peter Thiel attended Bilderberg and donated money to Ron Paul, that Ron Paul and libertarianism must be part of the globalist plot. He said Thiel wants to spew his poison of libertarianism and Austrian free market economics, and Americans want the New Deal. I mean, I am glad, Stan, that frankly that Tarpley has now been so honest about what his real position is. I'm hoping, that Alex will wake up and stop interviewing this guy.
If you notice, he is never on my programs, and I don't mean that derogatorily towards Alex at all, but I have never trusted Douglas Tarpley. I interviewed him one time, and that was all I needed. We'll be back in just a moment here with Joel Skousen, and I would simply say be very wary of anything this gentleman I'm speaking of, Webster Tarpley, says. He's a LaRouche follower, and Lyndon LaRouche, who was so far to the left, he even embarrassed the communists. We'll be back in a moment. Stan back here at the Genesis Communication Network, and Joel has just been talking about Webster Tarpley, and who is, of course, a disciple of Lyndon LaRouche. And if you read my book, I wrote it back in the early 90s. It was called AIDS, the Unnecessary Epidemic. I have a whole section there under Lyndon LaRouche, who is still trying to convince the conservatives that he is a conservative and they should follow him, and yet is the enemy of everything we stand for. Go right ahead.
Well, when Professor Karen Barrett launched into a conservative libertarian doctrine of the limited or constitutionally limited government, in his interview with Webster Tarpley, he had an "oh my God" moment. Tarpley went apoplectic that a professor would actually believe such an idea, limited government. He then expounded the liberal doctrine that the general welfare clause justified all these expansive programs and praised welfare, food stamps, and education programs. When Barrett talked about the government being the problem, Tarpley said the private sector was the problem, not government. You see, to Tarpley and LaRouche, who I believe are closet socialists, they see this globalist conspiracy as an attack on Marxism, and they exert all their effort to condemn it. I mean, not Marxism, but the free market, or what they call the private sector, and not for the same reasons we do. They condemn globalism because they think globalism is a capitalist conspiracy, when in fact it is a socialist conspiracy that has lured capitalists into collusion with government for personal gain. Tarpley would not condemn the same globalist power structure if he or LaRouche were running it. In fact, all of their socialist propositions indicate that they're on the same path to globalism as the globalists. Then Tarpley shows his antipathy towards Ron Paul. In a later interview that day with Alex Jones, he attacked Paul continually, to Jones's shock, who supports Paul. Tarpley claims that Ron Paul is locking up the anti-establishment vote to keeping Gingrich and Santorum and other, quote, good guys, that is, globalists and leftists, from winning. He claims the vote for Ron Paul is a vote for Romney, who the Bilderbergers supposedly support, but this is superficial analysis at best and fails to explain why the establishment has tried to stop Romney, both in 2008 and in the current election cycle. In this election cycle, the establishment had preference for the globalist camp followers like Rick Perry, Newt Gingrich, Herman Cain, and Rick Santorum. They've only jumped on the Romney bandwagon for control purposes and packed his team with neocon advisors after it became obvious that Romney was going to win. Whereas Tarpley calls Ron Paul a hypocrite and a warmonger of all things because he voted for the initial Afghan deployment of U.S. troops. Now, it is true that Paul voted with the majority for the original authorization for use of military force against terrorists in Afghanistan, which was a trumped-up phony charge, as we know now, but Ron Paul was naive at the time. This was immediately after 9/11, and it was an unthinking response on Paul's part to the September 11th attack. He has openly stated his regret in backing that vote and advocates withdrawing troops from Afghanistan because he believes a decade in war in Afghanistan has yielded only suffering and hatred for the U.S. For Tarpley to label Paul a warmonger for this one mistake shows that his skewed dislike for real champions of liberty. Here's Mr. Paul's real feelings about Afghanistan, and I quote, "There really is nothing for us to win in Afghanistan. Our mission has morphed into apprehending those who attacked us, to apprehending those who threaten and dislike us for invading their country, to remaking an entire political system and even a culture which cannot be done. This is an expensive, bloody, endless exercise of futility. Not everyone is willing to admit this yet, but every second that they spend in denial has real costs in the terms of lives and livelihood." That was Ron Paul's real feelings currently on the war in Afghanistan. Tarpley calls right-wing anarchists fascists, which is not true at all. This harks back to his leftist theology where Hitler and the Nazis, all socialists, were on the right. That's typical of the Europeans. And the good guys were moderate progressives on the left. Well, in reality, true political, the only thing that makes radical sense is that pro-government people are on the left and anti-government people on the right, and controlled limited government is in the center. That's the way that film Skousen, my uncle, and author of many great books on the Constitution, defined the proper left-right paradigm. Tarpley says Bilderberg reminds us that the private sector is where the evil is, implying that all private markets lead to governments controlled by conspiracy. So how does he explain Hitler and Stalin? Private sector tyrants? Hardly. Tarpley says Romney is their man now because they're meeting in his Mormon hotel chain. Again, this is superficial and erroneous analysis. Sure, the Marriotts who founded the chain were Mormons, but it has long since become an establishment corporation run by others. He claims that Ron Paul was intending to deliver Romney and any needed votes at the convention, which we will see is not true at all. He continues his implication that it must be the Mormons when he points out that Marco Rubio was also a Mormon. Well, that's also not true. While Rubio was baptized a Mormon as a child, he's never been a Mormon since or claimed it as his religion. And he also erroneously continues his anti-Mormon rant by saying that former candidate John Huntsman, also in attendance at Bilderberg this year, represents the wealthy backers of the Mormon Church. Well, the Mormon Church is not run by any wealthy backers. The Church is completely supported by voluntary tithing of its members, which in fact dwarfs the income of even the wealthiest of Mormon members. So, Tarpley, for the supposed brilliant historian, is showing that he's really very, very superficial in his analysis. Lastly, he laments how the new Bilderberg-backed Romney will take advantage of the backlash to Obama to, listen to this, cut America's throat by killing health care, Social Security, all these wonderful New Deal programs. I mean, I'm glad that Webster Tarpley is out of the closet. He's so open about his true allegiance. Hopefully talk show hosts like Jeff Friends, Alex Jones, and Kevin Barrett will be more careful in the future about interviewing this guy. In this interview that I quote in the brief with Alex Jones just really gets after him, and they have some pretty strong words. He calls it BS, what Tarpley kept saying, and he says, sorry to have to say this, I know you've been a friend to me for a long time, we're both from Texas, but this is just BS, he kept saying to Tarpley. As a side note, some of my readers wanted to know why Russian writer Daniel Estulin, author of a trilogy that exposes the Bilderberg Club, met with Fidel Castro in 2010 and said all kinds of nice things about him. During the discussion with Castro, Estulin thanked Fidel for the inclusion of fragments in his text of his most recent journalistic columns and reaffirmed the goal that they take down this globalist conspiracy. But you see, what this really reveals is that, like Tarpley, Estulin is a Russian writer coming from the left and against globalism, not because he's for liberty, but he's trying to protect Marxism. Well, in tomorrow's brief, I bring out a list of the latest attendees of interest to the Bilderberg conference, and so if people would like a free sample to read that list, they can email me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com.
Worldaffairsbrief.com. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen, right here at Radio Liberty. Well, Dr. Stan and Joel had just put out telling you how to get in touch with him, but I'll ask him to go ahead and get his information out once more and mention the books he's written, because they're very, very important. I think everyone at least needs to have these on hand to use as reference books. How can people get in touch with you, Joel, and what would you like to say about your books?
Thanks, Dan. My books are showcased on my website, joelskousen.com. Each of the books are shown pictures of them and content information. My top seller is the book Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. This is in its third edition, all new color maps and even a new section on foreign retreats. My largest book is The Secure Home, 700 pages from everything from A to Z on high security construction and self-sufficiency, so that one can be prepared in case of natural disasters or other things, even including war, to cover the full range of everything from EMP strikes to building high-security shelters. For those in the remodeling need, I have another smaller book called How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. And the shelter book talks about how to do a safe room within an existing basement. And all three of these books can be had from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, we're talking about the Bilderberg Conference, and when you study the list of the attendees, and there, of course, are secret people who end up showing up that don't want their name published on the official list. But as people can see, and we'll see if they get a sample copy of tomorrow's World Affairs Brief, there are hundreds of other globally connected big corporations who are part of the Globalist network whose CEOs don't go to Bilderberg. There are hundreds of controlled media heads and government ministers that don't attend. You cannot tell in a definitive way much about those that are invited to Bilderberg, other than one, that they're only a tiny fraction of those involved in this globalist control system, and two, that those that do come are not on our side. Sure, the older leaders like Henry Kissinger are always there, but it's a changing cross-section of leaders of media, industry, and government that show up to hobnob with the rich and powerful. It's invitation only. In large part, the meeting is about introducing secret agendas to new initiates and persons the globalists are cultivating. At the meeting, they watch to see how they react to globalist issues and solutions that they present, to see if they're going to be players with the globalists or non-enthusiasts who go nowhere. You have to have a lot more individual about each one of these people to know how deep they are into the globalist conspiracy. You cannot tell from attendance alone. The only thing we can be sure about newcomers that attend is that the Bilderbergs look with favor on them as a possible future member. Some don't pan out and never gain any higher position, and some do. But as I say, you have to watch them. But it is good to have a list, and when you combine that with the lists of the CFR members or Trilateral Committee members, you kind of get a picture of who's really important in their agenda. Well, one of the most worrisome developments is the degree to which the establishment has learned to cultivate globalists from within high-ranking military officers. Often this is a product of having flooded the high-ranking military schools, command and staff colleges for generals and field-grade officers with globalist professors and speakers. They've been doing this for years. It even happened when I was a military officer in the Marine Corps. This spring we've seen some of the highest-ranking officers addressing the Council on Foreign Relations and spouting the globalist party line. Last week I covered the fact that General Robert Keller, head of Strategic Command, which oversees U.S. nuclear missile forces, told the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington that China is no threat. They all loved it, of course, happy to see their constant propaganda to that effect taking hold within our military. Now comes the U.S. Army Chief of Staff advocating the use of the Army for domestic enforcement against domestic terror. Another key element the establishment has been slowly pushing upon the military. Well, the Council on Foreign Relations proposes that the U.S. Army be used to plan, command, and carry out, with the help of civilian law enforcement, domestic police missions. So says the story in the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs, and it's written by none other than Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, General Raymond T. Odierno. And the CFR would like to see the Army address these challenges to the U.S. from the point of a safe homeland. Well, of course, for Odierno, a person who's taken an oath to the Constitution and the laws of the land to write such a thing, is really a violation of his oath because it's against the Posse Comitatus Act. He says, where appropriate, we will also dedicate active duty forces, especially those with special skills and equipment, to provide civilian officers with a robust set of reliable, rapid response options. But we're talking about the same horrid results that we saw in Waco. General Odierno, third major change is the need, he says, to use the Army to solve complex international conflicts. Again, these conflicts and solutions to them are made more complex by the fact that there's not a single syllable, writes the New American, in the Constitution that grants the President or Congress the authority to deploy American armed forces to work out the world's difficulties. One of the unconstitutional missions advocated by Odierno and the CFR is the use of U.S. Army as a critical guarantor of stability in the Asia-Pacific region. This is one of the many assigned new missions promoted by Odierno in his Foreign Affairs article. So all of that's pretty disturbing. And we can include in that list, of course, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who is constantly spouting a lot of globalist stuff.
I share your concern. I really feel that any of these military officers who are simply going along with this idea of using the military to maintain the status quo are traitors to our nation and should be dealt with as such.
Well, talking about Europe now, in blatant disregard to the fiscal realities of the declining European and French economy, newly elected President Francois Hollande announced he was lowering the retirement age from 62 years to 60 years of age, imitating the bad policies of Greece that were symptomatic of government pandering to, quote, social consciousness. The newly elected French president, like Obama, plans to start increasing taxes on the rich, which is spurring a flight of the rich from France to Britain. This is not similar to the prepper movement to relocate for safety that's taken hold in the U.S., but it is a sign that class warfare drives the rich and the talented out of socialist countries into less socialist countries. There are no free market countries nowadays. Tax-hungry bureaucrats forget that the rich already pay the lion's share of taxes, and that when you squeeze them even more, you put downward pressure on the wealthy's ability to invest, much of which provides the engine of new job creation. And you also cause them to flee the country. That's what happened with the brain drain in England about 20 years ago when they raised their tax rates to almost 98%, marginal tax rate on the wealthy, and people started fleeing Britain, going to Canada and the U.S. Mr. Hollande wants to implement a 75% tax rate on earnings over let me translate this into dollars, over about $1 million on top of a 45% rate for people making $150,000 or more. In addition, France's high earners feel increasingly unwelcome in their own country, led by a man who admits that I don't like the rich. They're all looking to go to London. It comes as no surprise. David Cameron is cutting the 50% tax rate for income above £150,000 to 45%. This is still too high, of course, but you can see how expensive London looks good to rich Parisians who are paying even more, but still want access back to Paris when necessary, which they can get through air flights or the Channel train. All predator tax nations attempt to create limits on the ability of the rich to take their money out of the country. South Africa did so at the end of apartheid to keep people from leaving. And the U.S. is beginning to enact huge tax penalties as well. Under current law, as long as the Facebook billionaire Eduardo Severin pays his exit tax on everything he owns when he leaves the country, the IRS can't touch him. Although, having renounced his passport and citizenship, they'll never let him back in the country again.
Hold that thought. Well, Dr. Stan, our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. Joel, this is the last segment. Go right ahead.
Okay, we're talking about U.S. exit control taxes. They have an exit tax now where you have to pay as the Facebook billionaire who's leaving the country to keep the government from confiscating most of his taxes. He's still going to have to pay 15% of the market value of all of his assets, even those that he has paid taxes on before, reportedly valued at roughly $2.1 billion. So call it a $300 million capital gains tax bill, or give it a few $1 million, but this is really an egregious way to stop people from taking their money out of the country. For this reason, high earners in France are preparing to become expatriates to Britain. They have to change their behavior so it appears that they're not doing this for tax reasons. France already has laws that says you can't leave the country for tax reasons, or they have a special tax for your money. So they're having to set up elaborate legal ruses to make it appear as if they have a legitimate reason for living. hundreds of thousands of French have already left France. South Kensington and Chelsea around London are dubbed the unofficial 21st arrondissement, which means an area of Paris packed with French bankers and their families. And you know, the UK Telegraph also talked about with business people about the growing negative atmosphere of doing business in France. It says you have to have a very specific reason to have a business in France instead of the UK. For example, need of access to skilled workers or the need to be very close to French clients, he said. Sarkozy had implemented reduction in social changes to increase competitiveness in France. Such changes will disappear under Hollande, and labor costs, which are huge in France, are likely to rise. If you pay an employee £100,000 in London, the equivalent in France is already over £170,000 simply due to costs and administration. All of these numbers can be much higher if you start comparing it with the dollar, which is about $1.50 to the pound, or to the British pound, and $1.25 to the euro. The prices in the expensive parts of Europe are still 50% higher than the U.S., even with the strengthening dollar. So France and Europe are not very competitive, but it's all a matter of comparisons. People in France are fleeing to Britain, as expensive as London is, because it's much cheaper than France. Well, there's a backlash coming in the U.S. against austerity as well, as exemplified by the nasty recall election of Wisconsin Governor Walker. But in this case, it failed. Now the media is spinning the loss as an election brought on by billionaires. Had Big Labor won, of course, they never would have complained about the millions spent by Labor. Big labor unions are like the very leftist SEIU, Service Employees International Union, pulled out all the stops in order to recall the governor who successfully pushed through legislation to strip collective bargaining rights from state employees. Now, the wordage strip away rights may sound harsh, as if unions were being stripped of legitimate rights, but this is not true. In reality, collective bargaining rights refers to a whole list of special privileges granted by Congress during the New Deal era that no one could properly possess. They grant exclusive to members of unions the right to use coercive powers in law to stop employers from hiring replacement workers for less money when they can't agree on wages and benefits. So in other words, collective bargaining laws hold employers hostage to unions and actually are anti-workers. Employers are in favor of higher wages for themselves, but they hate other workers who would compete for lower wages. It has created a union mentality that still reigns today, and it's interesting to note that Wayne Allen Root wrote an article for Fox News stating that here's a typical letter from a Las Vegas teachers union member that hits at the new level of cluelessness and delusional behavior from union-type thinking. The writer says, for those who don't understand we are making so much money in the unions, it's simple. We're unionized and you're not. Those of us that work for government make so much more than you because we were smart enough to join unions. Only 6% of you folks in the private sector belong to unions, so you're the fools. Instead of attacking us for our bloated salaries and insanely high pensions, you should be joining a union and getting the same bloated salaries and insanely high pensions. So stop trying to tear us down. Instead, get the same deal for yourselves.
But I think what people don't understand is that when government employees can organize, and then they can use their dues to put politicians in, and they can put politicians into positions of power who will then give the unions money. And basically, of course, who represents the public? No one. The unions want more money. The politicians are willing to give it to them because they're getting something, at least in the general work scene. Why, of course, the employers have no vested interest in giving the employees more money in government. The employer who is a politician who gets money from the union benefits. And so the only way we're ever going to get back to anything logical at all is to outlaw government unions, and I think we're going to have to do that. And I think it's an idea this time has come, and it's going to spread across America, and of course the government employees down the line are going to lose an awful lot more than they've ever gained.
That's right. And, of course, a lot of them that even aren't unionized have way too high benefits and pensions. And states like Oregon almost went bankrupt. California's almost went bankrupt even without unionized employees because of the over-generous compensation. It's too easy for politicians, even in a small city, to say, oh, it's just taxpayer money. Give the employers a wage, give them, these big severance packages, and then you can't take them away. The courts won't allow you to do that often. So it's been a real problem.
And we've got employees, government employees out here in California who are making $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and they'll retire with those pensions. It's just,
that's right.
The whole system's going to come down. I fear we're out of time, Joe. God bless. Thanks very much. We'll look forward to talking to you next week.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, well, this is Dr.